task force was launched. Tom is going to be helping us talk about the big picture. Welcome, Tom. Following Tom will be Dr. Camilla Alexander-White. Cam is lead policy advisor, sustainable chemicals at the RSC. She's worked with various government bodies throughout her career and is particularly well placed to explain how science and policy comes together. Really important for that delivery and dialogue. Thank you, Cam. Next, we will have Rowan Conway, founder of the strategic design practice Transformation by Design. Rowan has worked with the RSC to help lead the mission design process for the Sustainable PLFs Task Force over the last year and has seen how the new PLFs roadmap has come together. Welcome, Rowan. And last but not least, Richard Miller, Associate Director of the Connected Places Catapult and co-founder of Miller Klein. Richard is a trained chemist and has more than 40 years of practical experience in innovation and sustainability across the private and public sectors. So please join me in welcoming the panel.
I'm going to have to step in and just pause things because our live stream isn't ready to go until 10 o'clock, so we will have to have
right,
okay, so
talk amongst yourselves. Yeah. How did your son get on in the crew? Welcome to this first panel session on what is sure to be a day of discussion and debate about how to drive the PLFs revolution. As Roy Sambach just said, this should be a dialogue for delivery. Today's event is going to be looking at innovations that are needed to transition to sustainable polymers in liquid formulations. And this first discussion the first panel will focus on the big picture for sustainable polymers. As Jill Reed just said, we've got stakeholders here, a collaboration across the ecosystem. Now, to help us, those stakeholders, 4 specialist speakers who have generously agreed to answer a few questions about what is needed, what is going to happen in the coming years. The first is Professor Tom Welton, Professor of Sustainable Chemistry at Imperial College London, also the President of the Royal Society of Chemistry from 2020 until 22, during which time the Sustainable PLFs Task Force was launched. Tom's going to be talking about the big picture, the sustainability agenda for PLFs. Welcome, Tom. Following Tom will be Dr. Camilla Alexander-White, who is Lead Policy Advisor for Sustainable Chemicals at the RSC. She's worked with various government bodies across her career and is particularly well placed to explain how science and policy come together. Thank you for joining us, Cam. Then we will have Rowan Conway, founder of the strategic design practice Transformation by Design. Rowan has worked with the RSC to help lead the mission design process for the Sustainable PLFs Task Force over the last year and has seen how the new PLFs roadmap has come together. Welcome, Rowan. And finally, last but not least, we have Richard Miller, Associate Director of the Connected Places Catapult and co-founder of Miller Klein. Richard is a trained chemist and has more than 40 years of practical experience in innovation and sustainability in the private and public sector. So please join me in welcoming our panel. Now, the way this is going to work is that I'm going to introduce each speaker in turn and give them one prompt question. Prompt as in, I'm going to prompt them, not as in a short question. It'll also be a short question. And each of the speakers in turn is going to make a sort of short presentation. Tom, let's start with you as former president of the RSC, expert in chemical sustainability. Can you give us some broad insights into the big sustainability challenges that affect PLFs? What does it mean for academic-led R&D, which is needed to drive the scale of innovation that we need to get to sustainable PLFs?
Okay, so there are a few things there, but let me start right from the beginning. So I studied in the early 1980s, and if you were a chemist who was interested in the environment back then, you were a tree-hugging hippie. And that really only started to change with, there's a thing called the Brundtland Report, Our Common Futures, a UN report, which started to define the idea of sustainable development. And so if you can define the idea of sustainable development, which was 600-page report, one sentence, which is to have development that meets the needs of the current generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. You can then start thinking about, well, what's sustainable chemistry mean? Because it means the implementation of that concept of sustainable development within the production, use, and fate of chemicals. But it also means the use of chemistry and chemical products to enable sustainable development to occur. And that idea did start to take some kind of hold in the last few years of the last century and the beginning of this. We now found ourselves a fantastic report here, the PLFs Revolution. But in reality, we've spent that last 40 years getting to the starting line. So let's congratulate ourselves on finally getting to the starting line, but that is where we are. And we now need to run the race. And we need to run the race quickly. And I kind of, when I start thinking about the sustainability of chemical entities, I think about it with 3 axes. So first of all, what is the service that this chemical provides to society? Is it vital? Is it frivolous? And we need to think about that. Now, that is really, it's not a bunch of chemists who are going to start answering those questions. This is a truly multidisciplinary effort. We then do have to think about what's the impact of that entity in the environment? Is it minimal? Is it severe? But really today, I think we're thinking much more about my third axis, which is how close are we to having the ability to, say, replace a chemical entity that we have decided is both vital and has a severe impact on the environment. And to do that, we need innovation. And as I said, we need it quickly. We can't wait 40 years to innovate our way out of our current sustainability challenges. We have to do it in a much shorter timescale. And the chemical enterprise, certainly here in the UK, maybe slightly less so in other parts of the world, other parts of Europe, but other parts of the world, maybe even more so. We're in an environment where, notwithstanding the visitors we have from BASF today and the truly giant scale of chemical industry, most of the chemical industry here in the UK is dominated by small and medium-sized enterprises, even micro-enterprises. And the most innovative of those are the smallest ones, very often spinning out from academic labs around the country. And they have a real problem. They have to get their technologies up the technology readiness levels, and they need to be got there quickly. And when I look across, I've been at Imperial College a long time. I've seen many I've been involved in one myself, but I've seen many spin-out companies happen. I've seen many spin-out companies fail. Very rarely is the failure due to the technology. The failure tends to be because the system doesn't enable those companies to be able to advance their technology levels up the TRLs to a point at which the market can take hold and start operating. And so that is, for me, is the biggest challenge that we face. How do we find a way of accelerating technologies up the TRLs, de-risking, as Roy said earlier on, so that we can get these innovations come to market quickly and effectively? And that's a huge, huge challenge. It will involve money. It's addressing a market failure. So it's going to involve government money. Not necessarily huge amounts. I was recently reviewing one of the transport catapults, and they were doing amazing work with £30,000 grants, where they were enabling companies to take their technologies up maybe a couple of TRLs at a time with remarkably small amounts of money for each individual company. But of course, you need to have it at scale. And you not only need to have it at scale, you need to have it in a coordinated fashion. And we're very fractured here in the UK. You look across the country, there are lots of sustainability centres in universities, there are lots of companies, there are regional developments here, but it is very fractured and very poorly coordinated, and we do need to address that. Finally, as a university representative here, is there something else we have to do? Which is, again, when I started as a lecturer and I was interviewing sixth form candidates to come to Imperial College. And back then in the early 90s, universally, they all said that they wanted to be a discovery chemist at a pharmaceutical company and invent a cure for cancer. A very laudable aim. Now, I start to see students coming through, candidates coming through who are saying, I want to positively impact on the environment. That is a fantastic change that young people are making. And they are placing a demand on us to generate an education which enables them to do that. And particularly one of the things, and I would put this out to my industrial colleagues, the pharmaceutical companies have been hugely effective at making being a discovery chemist in pharmaceuticals the glamour job for chemists. We need to turn sustainable chemistry into the glamour job for chemists. And so we will recruit the best and we will find the solutions that we need.
Thank you, Tom. We're both academics. I think it's not controversial to say that academia sometimes can be perceived as being a barrier to innovation or full of red tape. What do you think the types of things, the types of resources that are needed in academia for that tech transfer to happen?
So we have to remember there's good red tape as well as bad red tape, and particularly in chemical enterprises and my laboratory, I would not like to lose the red tape that keeps my students safe and well. And so we do have to address that there's some red tape we have to have, and it is more difficult in a chemical enterprise than it is if you're writing some app that you're going to put on a phone. You don't face the difficulties of that. And so we need to put in place systems that enable us to work safely as chemists throughout that innovation system. We do need to, and again, we don't need to invent anything here. There are some universities that do it extremely well. Some universities do support their academics to become entrepreneurs and to get their innovations out into the market. So there's nothing that needs inventing. We just need to apply it more generally and make sure that every lab which is coming up with inventions that can lead to the kind of innovations that we need can get that support. And again, that means we need to do some things slightly differently in that at the moment we have constructed our universities as being largely in competition with each other. And so what that means is if you're in a big, successful science institution like I am, you're going to get all the support you need. If you're in a post-92 university or a smaller university, you're going to struggle to get it. And good ideas happen everywhere, not just in places like the one that I work in.
How personality-driven do you think it is in terms of if you've got a great idea or you've got a big, innovative idea, that where is the framework around you of people who are going to say, yes, you need to be doing this?
I think it is very personality driven. I've been involved, I've very carefully said been involved with one spin out, because in spite of my incredible capacity for work, God, I don't have enough capacity for that work as well, on top of everything else. It just looks exhausting. And so something has to be done about that. Something has to give. It always being that this is something that you do on top of everything else you do is not going to generate what we need. There needs to be a way of finding the space, time, and energy for people to be able to do that. Otherwise, I mean, you do get the super driven people that do it, but you have to be so super driven that it's not effective on a system level. And
Imperial is well known for being, well, a hugely successful STEM university, but also very good at tech transfer and has an enormous framework. Could you give us a little bit of insight into the sort of processes that Imperial does very well?
So, so we have an entire system in place that has also been in place for a long, long time. It's not something that we're new to. And so there are people whose job it is to enable me to spin out technologies from my lab. And as much as sitting at Imperial, I might complain that there aren't enough of them, they're not attentive enough. And like you say, we have far more support in that area than the vast majority of people. But it's when you're very first starting out, what you're trying to access is knowledge and experience and help. Then, of course, there's the transition to now I'm starting to try and access money. And you need to have both of those things. There's no point getting all the help and support if then you can't get access to the venture capital that you need in order to fund what it is that you're doing. And similarly, there's no point having access to the money if you don't have the help. And so you need to have both of those things operating.
And in terms of it being proactive or reactive, you've got the idea, someone comes to you and say, this is how we need to drive this forward, or do you go to them?
So we go to them, but once a week they're sitting in an office on my floor. So going to them is not a difficult thing. It's literally, it's a shorter walk than it is across this room. And so making it not just available, but accessible is what's required.
Okay, that's extremely useful and practical advice too. Let's move on to Camilla Alexander-White. Now, you have direct experience reviewing the safety of product critical ingredients for environmental contaminants coming under regulatory scrutiny all around the world for that. Now, given the sustainability challenges outlined in the PLFs reports, what do you think it will take for governments around the world to really get hold of this challenge?
Yeah, thanks for that, Adam. So yes, I work at the Science Policy Interface, where you're always taking the latest data, science and evidence and trying to translate that into new policies. And at the RSC, we've worked on a parallel programme of work within the policy and evidence team, now trying to influence at the United Nations. So these topics of discussion come up at the United Nations, different kinds of chemical topics, but already there are 19 different issues of concern on the chemicals pollution agenda, of which this is not one of them at the moment. So in order to be able to really highlight this kind of work and get it into the minds of the policymakers at a supranational level, then it's a hard ask to try and break into that world where there's already 19 big issues. So on page 12 of the report, the actions for supranational policymakers and funders, that first one is about how we can influence through a new body called the Science Policy Panel for Chemicals, Waste and Pollution Prevention. So this is a new panel that was set up through UNEA, the United Nations Environment Assembly. A resolution was made just a year or so ago. And bodies like the RSC and other professional bodies and industry, multi-stakeholders, as Tom is saying, it's a multi-stakeholder problem. And so that's a place and a forum where people can actually come together and discuss the issues of the day as independently as possible from the politics as well. And the other thing that is notable in the United Nations work, though, again alluding to both what Roy and Tom are saying, is it's slow. It's like a tanker moving through thick water. So there's something needed to make these issues more urgent. So the other thing that will be part of that work of the new UN policy panel is a prioritization framework that's needed. And at the moment as well, you have to kind of realize just how low on the international agenda chemicals are, generally as a topic. That's true in the UN context and in the UK policy context. One place where it's been quite big, of course, is in Europe and the European regulation called REACH, the Registration, Evaluation, Authorization and Restriction of Chemicals. So that EU umbrella regulation that was there put chemicals quite high priority within Europe. And so there's been a lot of work over the past 15 years. Now, notably, though, polymers were exempt from that regulation until very recently. So there's been no regulatory drivers to really act in this space because there was an exemption within that very big regulatory arena in Europe. And the UN doesn't have these materials on its agenda, and we in the UK don't really have chemicals very well on our agenda because of Brexit. So I'll just speak a little bit about the UK policy agenda. Post-Brexit, of course, the UK, England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland these are devolved matters. So the responsibilities for the regulation and policy in these areas are devolved. And also it's a very new world because we've been working within the European Union for at least since 2004, if not before. Now for the last 2 years, the guys in the civil service across the government departments that I work with as a government science advisor, you see the resources are stretched and the knowledge and the skills may need developing within the UK context. So if there's then an ambition for the UK to be a world leader out there and drive through UK policy and regulation through into the UN agenda and even the Europe agenda still, then there's quite a bit of influencing to do, to want a better word. So hopefully at the RSC we can do some of that influencing using reports like this, which have got some great key lines, headlines in them to grab the attention of the parliamentarians and the politicians and here in the Lords to raise the awareness of these bigger problems, because it's a very competitive world of chemicals issues. You've got things like the poly and perfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS, which are a massive, massive substance and will be high on the UN's agenda, endocrine disruptors, lead, mercury, arsenic. So this whole area of chemicals pollution is a very busy area, and at the minute there's no real prioritization mechanism for helping the the politicians and the civil servants, which one of these are the most urgent, which one of these are causing the most problems at the current time. So that's the landscape that this report will go into. And so we're hoping to then start the science policy interface to raise more awareness about this whole area, firstly, and hopefully make it evidence-based, drawing on the best science that we can. So yeah, that's
that's fascinating, especially given that forums like this, this is, as you say, this is about exposing and promoting the ideas. But what about from the other side? So where is there an appetite within government or within the people that you are effectively lobbying to receive this information and therefore act on the recommendations?
There's an open door, I would say. There is always an open door for reports like this, because the information and knowledge into all these places is king. But I can hear them all saying now, going, oh no, not another problem to deal with. So you have to anticipate that that's the world that we're going into, because there are a lot of problems here that are not currently addressed. So they will very well receive a report like this, but they then say, well, how do I prioritize this problem versus all the other issues that are there as well? So they'll receive it well, but then some priorities got to be made.
Right, because you don't want it getting filed along with the other 19, which somehow have got a higher priority. I teach a science communication course at UCL, and one of the sessions is on, because the assumption is it's all about talking to the media or presenting your work, but also one of the sessions is on how to talk to policymakers. And it's extremely popular as a topic, because it's not something that scientists get as a default. At some point, you will be talking to government advisors or policymakers. So how do you approach that when you've got a report or roadmap? How do you go in?
There's a real element of trust and credibility here. So it takes years to really build up trusted relationships with policymakers. So again, organisations like the RSC have made that a priority in influencing. Other organisations do the same. But as Tom said as well, sometimes they respond to who shouts loudest, which isn't always the right thing. And there are lots of vocal communities out there really influencing. But what we try to do is bring the evidence and the facts, which this report does very nicely, and build trust and credibility with the different regulators out there and policymakers.
I like the idea that you've now invented a new term, which is chemical influencer.
Very good.
Put that on your Instagram. How do you think that the chemical? Oh, by the way, if you want to chip in and ask a question, then please, in radio science, I'll just use hand actions like this. Yes. Cam, how do you think the chemical regulations and international chemicals policies need to evolve in the next decade or so?
There is a lot of fragmentation in this area. So you find lots of people doing bits and pieces. This is true in an international context. At the United Nations and OECD level, you get WHO doing something, environment agencies doing something, CEFIC and industry bodies doing something. So you get a lot of different pieces of the jigsaw done in a very fragmented way in the United Nations context. Same in the UK. So in the UK, you have DEFRA responsible for something, Environment Agency, Department of Business and Trade, now they've changed their name, Health Security Agency. Everybody's got a different piece. And so one of the policies that's in the booklet as well, and a general policy, not just for PLFs, but generally for chemicals, is if we have a more coordinated national regulator. We didn't need that pre-Brexit, we need that post-Brexit to have a really coordinated and centralised chemicals regulator that has got national credibility and authority on the world stage as well. At the moment, no disrespect to the current regulatory teams, because they've been thrown into having to do regulation at a very, very difficult time. There's some excellent staff there, but there probably aren't enough of the right types of skilled staff to be able to perform a regime. So we need more workers at the science policy interface in the UK, a consolidated chemicals regulator that can actually look at all the evidence from all of the pieces of the jigsaw and make holistic decisions and advise policymakers in a more coordinated and efficient way.
And in terms of I mean, you mentioned shout. Sometimes it's the people who shout loudest. How is part of the roadmap? Is part of this discussion how PLFs are pushed up the agenda so they are much more visible to the regulators?
It is a part of the whole process to have the conversations. Yeah, you mentioned the media. Should you use a media tool to do that? We have some good comms, but a lot of the conversations do happen quietly as well, just to raise MPs' awareness or various stakeholders' awarenesses. So we have an influencing way that is all-inclusive with multi-stakeholders. And so it is part of a planned program now that we probably need to do in this next phase to be able to influence all the right people with multiple different ways. A report is a good starting point, having something tangible, and then an actual plan now to engage the right people. We'll have an election soon as well, of course. All the ministers will change. So we have to work in this changing landscape and try and influence as we go as well. So yeah, there will need to be a good plan in place.
Richard, you had a comment?
Yeah, I've got a question really for both Tom and Camilla, which is about, you both talked about regulation as both a positive and a negative and how you manage that. I remember listening to a talk a couple of years ago from a financial regulator talking about how they created sandpits where ideas could be tested out in a way which would find out if it was a good idea or wouldn't bring the whole system crashing down. And I wonder, in the world of the precautionary principle, whether there's space for a way of allowing a bit more loose testing of new concepts, new materials, so they don't have to go through all the procedures first, but you kind of find out whether it's a good idea or not.
Well, we're both, so I'll have a go from the, as it were, the technical end. And so I think what it really is, it's about the scale. And, if you think about at the moment, the concept in the European Union of the safe and sustainable by design. And so if I have a, billion-ton product that is close to market, or I have something in a 5 ml round bottom flask in Tom Welton's hand in his lab, how do I apply that concept of safe and sustainable design at a sensible way for all of those different scales, including the most likely thing that is going to happen in the thing in the 5 ml round bottom flask in my hand is nothing. And so I think it's about that. It's about a recognition of the scale that you're at, where you are in the TRLs, and applying something which is appropriate at those different levels that is not so egregious that it swamps the small company that is trying to do it, but is still robust enough that it enables that things aren't progressed up the TRLs that actually you could have told at a much earlier stage were never going to be allowed to hit the market.
That regulators understand that?
Some do, some don't, I think is the truth. It's something that, amongst them is considered for me, what I said is just trivially easy, but for them is a very sophisticated idea. And so it is about enabling the regulators to be able to do that. And I have to speak up for Cam, Tanya and Steph and her team. One of the things that they have managed to do very successfully, particularly with DEFRA, is change the relationship between us and them, in that the RSC was seen for many, many, many years as just another lobby group, whereas now it is a trusted advisor. And you need to have that relationship in order to be able to then explore these more complex ideas.
Thanks for the kind words. Can I build on this as well? Because I think you talk about innovation in the sense of new chemicals maybe, or new technologies, but there is innovation possible in the regulatory landscape as well. And in the UK, a lot is being considered in this because we've got new science that can be applied in regulation as well. There's the whole area of new approach methods, which is around doing safety assessment without animal testing, for example. And so, the UK can be a real leader in that. It's had a lot of good funding and input in those areas where there's new science that could be applied in looking at early screening for substances in a sandpit kind of idea. So there is regulatory innovation that could be applied in this space to help things move quicker as well.
Okay, let's move on to Rowan Conway. Now, it's increasingly recognised that the big sustainability challenges, things like the transition to a low carbon energy system, they can't be dealt with simply via single market solutions and incremental innovation. They are much more like complex design problems, and they require radical innovations across multiple domains in this ecosystem. Rowan, you've led this collaborative design process. Can you share your thoughts on what it will take to enable this direction for PLFs and to bring the industry and the innovation with you?
Sure. I think firstly, I would say that it's a co-design process. And so therefore I have co-led with the amazing Anju Masibruka, who, and I think that connection between the design process and the facilitation and hosting and the domain expertise is the first reach, if you like, into transdisciplinary practice that will do this kind of work. I think, I'm keen to kind of echo a bit of what Tom said at the beginning about, the heritage of the idea of sustainability and actually how far we've come. And we've just come to a starting line, but we've all been getting kind of ready for the marathon, if you like, because it's not a sprint, it's now a marathon, but you need a series of kind of catalysts to move some things faster than other things. I was in sustainability 25 years ago. That's when I met Richard the first time, and Richard was working in chemistry with the first job title I'd heard of someone who had sustainability in his job title. But the kind of normative turn towards sustainability is still quite new, or it feels quite new for people who aren't old hands at it, like all of us. Sorry to make everyone feel old. But how we take that direction. So effectively, the reason why we approached using a mission approach was to recognize that we had to have a direction in order to move forward together. Without that shared direction, there's just an awful lot, as Camilla was illustrating. There is so much to think about. It's a very busy domain, this area. So thinking about what is the priorities are very challenging. And when we were doing some of our stakeholder interviews with policy stakeholders, one memorable thing that stood out was someone saying, well, the thing about PLFs, they haven't really had their blue planet moment yet, though, have they? And that really resonated with us, recognizing this is a very large area. You can talk about the scale of this challenge. You can talk about the issue, but it doesn't dock into the net zero challenge at the top tier. So funders don't see it as quickly as others. And it doesn't have this kind of charismatic public narrative either. So this interesting challenge of coordination is not just about how you get people in the room. It's also about how you work with the energy of willing participants to make change, so that we can look at what it's like to be at this starting line and then run the race together. Some of us running considerably more slowly than others. If I was in a marathon, I'd come last. Other people would come much, much farther ahead of me. And we need that, if you like, metaphor to be how we think about this mission transition. As Roy said earlier, we have to do an awful lot. We're at an inflection point in our moment in history. We have to make extremely fast transitions within the next 10 years. But this has been done a lot in energy, and we can see that some of this we can learn a little bit from other transitions to do that. So the missions, if you like, are different from kind of market-driven innovation, which sees a consumer market and designs for it. It brings that what's possible with what's needed together, and bang, there you go, someone's going to do it. We have the what's possible, we have what's needed, but all of the kind of issues of funding it or coordinating it need to work at a bigger level than just at a firm level. So that was, I guess, the purpose of this, was to go beyond this idea of, adding to the influence in the marketplace of ideas, but actually starting to build it as an enduring dialogue that can actually move towards delivery and have some of the policy experimentation at the same time. So alongside the experimentation in terms of the new forms of feedstocks in polymers. So you're trying to create this kind of whole ecosystem that can enable a shift in the way that we we see what innovation really is. And don't underestimate, that's very challenging for many firms who have an established understanding of innovation. And as Tom pointed out, it's not just firms that are competitive with each other, it's academics are competitive with each other. It's actually policy is competitive with each other. So you're working in an ecosystem that is all very used to being competitive. And when you're telling them things that don't kind of fit with their normative understanding of the world, that can actually be incredibly, you have to hold a lot of the rationale for it within the design process. So that's what I've been working on, is to try and enable a clear design process. We know where we are and we're moving towards the starting line so that we can all then work together in whatever way to deliver against the goals set in the missions.
I mean, it clearly is a complex ecosystem. We've heard from various stakeholders, and Richard will come after you. Can you elaborate a little bit on how mission-based innovation works, and how the broader ecosystem coalesces around that as a sort of central hub?
Well, it's still a relatively nascent area at scale. I mean, missions have been used for decades in terms of innovation, and people will talk about moonshots and how people came to, cross-disciplinary teams came together to achieve goals. But missions are now being kind of driven at scale through policy changes, largely that came out of trying to be aligned with the Paris Agreement and COP, to start saying we need to actually make these transitions, particularly in the EU and the European Commission. I chair the mutual learning exercise on governance for mission-oriented innovation in the EU, and that, working with those member states, there is no single template for how this works. People are working out what governance works for the different challenges, because with complexity, you'll need context. You can't just have a ubiquitous mission-oriented innovation approach. What you have to do is the centrality of the mission. So the mission matters most, and then you work the innovation around the context of that mission. So it's still an emerging field, but it's an emerging field with a vast amount of certainly government money moving into it. there's over 30 billion in euros in terms of the Horizon 2020 funding that are earmarked for missions over the course of till 2027. And there is increasingly this kind of challenge-oriented innovation funding that we're seeing coming out of UKRI as well. So that the ecosystem is seeing that this is part of the innovation landscape, but it's not necessarily worked out how to coordinate it, to really understand where to put those priorities. And I think Camilla really hit on something very resonant for me, which is, how do you really work with the grain of what's needed, as opposed to something that becomes quite hierarchical from coming down from the EU saying, well, we have the Green New Deal, we need to do this, and then we need to do this, and we need to do this. And it's not actually in line with what industry's doing. And that's why it was so fascinating to work with the task force, because actually we were kind of, someone said to me in the task force, it's kind of strange doing this from the bottom up, but it was important to really understand that context so that we could be the influencers, if you like, into the system about what needs to happen.
Go ahead, Richard.
So, Rowan, one of the things about the problems we're talking about here is they don't have neat boundaries. And very often there are other players who need to be involved. So when you're kind of creating one of these projects, how do you identify the people who you are not used to talking to that you need to bring into the debate? And how do you persuade them to engage with you?
I think this is where I'd lean a little bit to my esteemed colleague at UCL, Mariana Massacotti, who would say you work with the willing. And as much as anything, that's not saying, you only work with the willing and that you don't go where it's hard. But actually, it's a bit of a flippant thing to say, but in many instances, there are conversations you don't need to have. The conversation of should we be doing this is not a conversation that we really have time to have. So I kind of play my get out of jail free card, or my system override card of climate change I win. We're not having that conversation about whether we should do it. If you don't want to be in the team, that's fine. Let's let others who are willing be in the team. And that, I don't think I said that to any of the members of the task force, but that was kind of the vibe that we're trying to work with. Is there are some conversations that are redundant in this context. Doesn't mean they're redundant. Conversations about the economy are certainly active and live elsewhere, but it's not a kind of, let's have a binary debate about whether we should or whether we shouldn't. in this context, we are going to do it. So if you want to be part of this, then let's work out how.
It's very interesting. You talk about the narrative and the fact that the ecosystem is changing, and we no longer need to have the conversation, which is, should we be doing this? And Tom mentioned that undergraduates are now coming up with their main focus, their motivation being in sustainability, in chemistry. Do you think that the public narrative does that hasn't really happened yet? You say it hasn't had PLFs haven't had their blue planet moment.
And my question would be, do they need to? Because actually Blue Planet has said there's a problem. Back in the day when I was working in sustainability in like 2003, we would say you always need charismatic megafauna. You need to have the polar bear on an ice sheet in order for people to understand that there's a problem. At that kind of cartoon level, PLFs are never going to be at that cartoon level. That's why actually what you need is to say, we are docking into a wider narrative. And that wider narrative is a sustainability conversation, which has been won. And now the detail, if we want to get to the point of delivery, which is what Roy was talking about earlier, you fundamentally need to get into what does it look like in action terms. And then have the wide portfolio of experimentation, which allows you to have some level of failure rate in that too. Because the problem with the sort of dogma of we're all, in a sprint and we just got to get there, is that we also need to allow for some of that failure along the sides. We need to have the capacity to learn and experiment to get us the kind of innovation that they'll meet that big narrative. But I don't think you need to create the big narrative. You just need to say we are in line with that narrative.
And you need to have stakeholders in every one of the spheres that surrounds the central mission. So the mission has to be very clearly delineated and defined?
Yeah, I mean, we created a landscape framework as part of the process to recognize that our missions are very focused on fate. They are looking at biodegradability and they're looking at circular economy principles for end of life, effectively, of PLFs. But we have to recognize that this is a holistic sustainability landscape. And I think Camilla was referring to it earlier. So we created this sort of 5Fs framework, which meant that it covered everything from feedstocks, formulation, functionality, fate, and future. So you can say at some point, we are going to need to have innovation priorities in every part of this. The missions, if you like, are our sprinters. We need to get to that bit first, but our marathon runners need to be in every single category area, and the futures people might be coming out last, like me.
It sounds like an Olympic team, the way you're describing it.
Yes, I'm kind of imagining it like that. Yeah.
Yes, that can definitely work. I remember an MP telling me once that the number of questions, the number of letters they had to receive in order to take a topic seriously was 6. Now, this was in the pre-email era, so it may have changed by now. And this MP who'd been in Parliament for 30 years said that the number of letters that he'd ever had on any scientific topic was 3.
Oh my goodness.
In total.
Well, there's your influencer agenda, isn't it?
Right. And this is relevant to CAM. Whereas the moving of the bus stop from that road to that road, the WI would get involved and send 400 letters, and then it's a question in Parliament.
Yeah.
So, right.
So, it's your point. And I'll have a question back, if I may, as well, because I mean the agendas of climate change have been very visible, haven't they? And you can see the polar bear on the melting ice cap, and the biodiversity loss that Bob Watson works on. That's quite a visible thing, because you can get very good data and things on how species are becoming extinct, and that kind of it can be visualized. The chemicals pollution area, which is the third part of the triumvirate of the problems of the world, these things are insidious and you can't see them. So the water pollution aspects of the PLFs and other chemicals, the public can't see the issue immediately. And it's very difficult to visualize, in the public's mind, I would imagine, the problem. Because as scientists, we can have different types of data and different types of knowledge and understanding that we bring to bear from toxicology and exposure science. But the general public, how can we make it live? How can we make it visible so that we can explain the problem in this area really clearly?
I'm not sure that I know the answer to that. I think that it comes back to that kind of how do you create a narrative that means that you can get to action? I think because I'm not sure we need to illustrate the problem, I think everyone's absolutely terrified now, actually, in terms of recognition of the impacts of climate change, recognition of the impacts of species loss and extinctions. These are now in public discourse in a way that they profoundly weren't when I was working in sustainability. So I'm not sure I'd want to add to the anxiety load and say, you know, there's a lot of chemicals that are doing bad stuff too. It's more to recognize that how do we work on the challenge and where do we prioritize? I think it's really, really, and this is why, you know, being able to find commonalities where we can get upstream with the players in the task force, you know, how do we, and we talked before about life cycle analysis, how do you reduce the number of people who are doing really, really early stage fundamental research, which actually could quite, you know, be collated and they could all learn from the same thing so that they can get a lot more practical. We can draw people through the actual applied work more quickly. I guess I would continue to always try and dock into that top line narrative.
Fascinating. We must move on to Richard. It's a bit like question time, this, but all the people aren't horrible.
There's heckling from the audience.
Yes. Richard Miller, so you've been working in sustainable chemicals for many years, but sustainability is much more than simply to switch to renewable energy. So this transformation specifically targets the petrochemical basis for the whole industry, and we need and pushes for transformative change. Can you tell us more about how to break the link between fossil feedstocks and future polymers?
Well, I'll try and talk about certainly the issues. I think if I knew how to break it, I'd be out there making an incredible amount of money. But right now, I think the first thing to say is that this is a massive transformation. And it's a transformation that an awful lot of people in different sectors haven't got their mind around yet. So if you think about how much of the oil and gas we produce goes into heating, goes into transport fuels, goes into energy generation, those main applications, and we are busy switching away from that. So the question then becomes, what happens to that entire industry? I mean, don't forget that the chemical industry was born out of trying to figure out what to do with that heap of stinking garbage in the corner of the Coke site. You know, it was waste. What are we going to do with this? And out of that comes a whole generation of new types of chemicals, and the pharmaceutical industry and the dye industry and Perkin and all this stuff comes out of what the hell we're going to do with the waste of producing town gas. So this transformation is we're about to go through again, and we're going to lose potentially the feedstock which we've been used to. So the refinery industry is going to change. And at the moment, and I'm going to simplify everything hugely, at the moment, we largely get all of our chemicals out of 7 key intermediates that come out of the refinery process. What I call the Magnificent Seven. Right? And then we use our wonderful chemistry to convert all of those 7 key ingredients into everything else. Add a few bits of other hydrogen and water and a few other bits and pieces. But essentially, that's what we do. So what does a future in which you've decoupled that from oil and gas actually look like? I think we probably, at one level, we know how to do this. So if I sat down with Tom or anyone in this room and said, okay, we haven't got oil and gas anymore, what are we going to do? We could write down the equations, we could write down the processes that would do it, and they largely exist. But the problem is we can't kind of make it happen. It's back to systems and transitioning systems, and what are the forces going to make that happen? So there are 2 broad approaches, again, horribly simplifying. We can take our existing petrochemical industry, and we can say, we're not going to feed it with oil and gas anymore. We're going to feed it with other sources of carbon, renewable carbon. And there's a huge amount of work going along this, and we know the processes. We can take any organic matter, we can pyrolyze it, we can produce syngas, and then we know how to kind of pop the beads together and make the polymers and all the things that we want. So we can do that. The other approach is to say, no, that's very much 20th century. Let's have some new chemistries. Let's do things in a different way. Let's have different ingredients which come from different feedstocks, processed in different ways, a lot of bio-based processing, that kind of thinking. We'll have some completely new materials. And those two strategies are kind of being explored. They each have their strengths and their weaknesses. The great thing about the let's just have a different feedstock is that, you know, we're using the equipment and the chemistries and the technologies we already understand. So it's kind of a relatively small change. But there are severe problems. Where do we get that carbon, that non-fossil carbon from? And most of the people I talk to wave their arms and say, well, we produce huge amounts of waste. So let's take the waste. What they don't understand is quite how many vegetable peelings you need to replace an oil well. So the whole dynamic changes. Where are you going to get the carbon from? How are you going to do it? And so McKinsey did a report this year. They looked at, could you transition refineries in North America onto agricultural feedstock, waste wood, domestic waste, those kinds of things. And they reckon that most of them could not be transitioned, largely because they're in the wrong place. Because you need to have a lot of the waste in a transportable distance in order to make that process work. So that I think they came up with something like there would be 3 refineries in North America that could make the transition. And all the rest would have to be new build and doing it differently. So there's the problem of where we are and how you move to that new situation. On the other idea about that is let's use carbon capture, use and storage. So let's just take the carbon dioxide out of a rich stream from a factory, and let's take it direct from the air, and we'll use that as our carbon feedstock, and away we go. Again, we know how to do it. It's been demonstrated. There are pilot plants. There's various experiments been done, but you know, what would that new industry look like? You're changing a whole bunch of things. The economics of those industries are changing completely. In the alternative chemistries, there are some really clever ideas. There are people working in the universities on synthetic biology. So instead of the old-fashioned, you know, biotransformation of mutating a bug and getting it to kind of make something you want, most cases those bugs are very unhappy. And really hard to make them productive. So they're now using the process of synthetic biology, actually introducing totally new genetic pathways into bugs that are kind of separate from actually the basic metabolism, and saying, well, this is a way we can produce a whole range of these chemicals or intermediates. And again, it's been proved at the lab scale. How do you get there from here? Back to the TRL issue that Tom was raising at the beginning. So we know how to do it, but it's very, very difficult to break into that process and make the transition. And Tom talked about the number of small companies. In the case of something I'm familiar with, which is surfactants, used a lot in these kind of consumer chemicals we're talking about. Non-ionic surfactants, there is a totally bio-derived alternative just about to every single one. There's 2 problems. One is the price is a bit high at the moment, and that speaks to learning curves. And again, how do you build, how do you scale so that those learning curves come into place and you get the reduction in cost? And the other problem is just capacity, because as somebody from one of these user companies said to me, if I find a technically acceptable alternative to a material I'm worried about, a surfactant I'm worried about, and it passes all the technical tests, my first question to the supplier is, great, fantastic, you got the deal. Can I have 1 million tons a year starting next week? And of course, these small companies can't do that. So there's a role, I think there are lots of integrated roles where the users can be helping to pull through these things by engaging with companies at an earlier stage and helping to drive it through. We have done this before. I mean, we have successfully made this kind of transition in consumer chemicals with the Montreal Protocol. Right? The Montreal Protocol, there was an international agreement to ban a class of materials from use. And I was in Unilever at the time, and those materials were used in underarm deodorants, in spray deodorants. And the engineers were going, oh, well, people are going to have to get used to, you know, it won't be cooling anymore. It won't have that nice feel. The droplets will be bigger. It will be wetter. It will take longer to dry. It'll all be unattractive to the consumer. But they're going to have to live with it because we've got the Montreal Protocol. And the consumers basically turned around to the industry and said, no, we like it being cold and giving a nice feel and drying quickly and all those benefits. Go and fix it. And ultimately, the industry fixed it and many other problems connected with CFCs. So when there is that kind of collective agreement that we have to change now, just as has been mentioned earlier with some of the work on the COVID vaccines and things like that, we can do these things. But it does require that push and that pull to come together. You really can't have one without the other. And then just to throw in the last point, which is about all the other industries that are transitioning at the same time. So with long-range aviation, it's not going to work with batteries. Right? You can maybe have battery planes for short haul, but long-range, intercontinental, we need something that's really energy dense as a fuel. And so people are looking at synthetic aviation fuel. And there are a whole variety of those, ranging from hydrogenated used vegetable oil, all the way through to direct air capture and construction using carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And that's all being worked on, and that will deliver. There is a hell of a push behind that. There is a vastly bigger push, both from consumers and regulators and the industry to do that than there is on PLFs. So how much of the energy and the capability will go into solving that problem? And will it be a situation that by solving that problem, we solve our intermediates problem and we get a whole range of new intermediates we can play with to make these ingredients? Or is it just going to take all the attention away? Another example would be hydrogen. So we're going to need green hydrogen to move away from fossil fuels. It's a key part of the processes we're working on. We can get green hydrogen from hydrolysis using renewable energy. Great. Steel industry wants green hydrogen. They're busy converting to green steel and prototyping that and working on that by using green hydrogen, demonstrating that with electric arc furnaces, particularly in Sweden. The fertilizer industry wants green hydrogen. It would like to carry on using the Haber-Bosch process. Knows how to work that. And if they could have green hydrogen, then a lot of their problems would go away. Are we going to compete with that? The glass industry wants to use hydrogen. So actually, we're not only in competition for the feedstock, we're in competition with the development of the different processes, and we're in competition with other industries for that key capability to produce the green hydrogen. So I haven't answered the question. I've just shown how difficult it is, but it's interesting.
We've only got 2 minutes left before the feed stops, but I just want, so I'm going to have to wrap up. But it sounds to me that, I mean, in some ways, you've sort of brought together all of the different issues that the panelists have raised, but specifically, for example, using biological innovations, using synthetic biology, scale appears to be the biggest challenge. And yet, as Jill Reid said, that we can do big scale biological innovations with insulin production or with vaccines in the last couple of years.
Or citric acid or lactic acid, bulk chemicals that are produced almost entirely by biological processes.
So what is the barrier? What are the barriers for small biological innovations that could be upscaled potentially in order to help us free ourselves from fossil feedstocks?
Lack of demand. It's simply that. It's this thing that we haven't reached that Montreal Protocol point where everyone's saying we're not going to use fossil carbon in the future, and we are going to have to find solutions. And then the people with the solutions can find partners to work with. I think it's the challenge that if I'm sitting there as a user of these chemicals and I'm just a blender of stuff to make consumer products, if I'm not being made to come out of fossil carbon, and fossil carbon is still there and it's available to my competitors, and the alternatives are more expensive and don't perform any better, what's the incentive for me? So it's the push and the pull that need to come together.
Yeah, so there are existing treaties that could have this in it. Yeah.
Okay, well, this was the big picture panel to set us up for the conversations that will happen over the rest of the day. We are just about out of time, so I'm going to have to draw this to a close. So let me thank the panelists, Tom Welton, Camilla Alexander-White, Rowan Conway, and Richard Miller. Could you give them a big round of applause for their insights? So we're going to wrap up this session right now. We're going to have a 15-minute break so you can jump out and get another cup of coffee, and we'll be back here at 11:15 to dive into the industry perspective. So thank you all to the panelists again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Look at that. There's the timer. Welcome to the second panel discussion today, exploring the PLFs Revolution. Now, in this session, we're going to be just looking at what it takes in practice to drive sustainability transitions in industry. And again, we're lucky to have an amazing panel of practitioners, both on the industry side, who are actively focused on innovation for sustainable PLFs, and also those working in different and adjacent industry and policy areas, such as plastics, the built environment, renewable energy, also to share insights with what this program can learn from them. So without further ado, let's meet our panel. So we're going to go from right to left. Ian Tooley is Vice President of Chemistry at Croda, where he leads the global synthesis teams on sustainable new molecule development. He's also a member of the Sustainability Committee, where his activities are focused on increasing the bio-based contents of Croda's ingredients portfolio and reducing downstream Scope 3 emissions. He joined Croda in 2006 from ICI, following 6 years of research into modified nanoparticles for solar protection applications. His PhD was on the surface characterization of titanium oxide nanoparticles. Welcome, Ian. Thank you. Next to Ian, we have Harry Baratza, who is an industrial research leader working at the interface of chemical engineering, technology management, advanced product manufacturing, service innovation, and intellectual property law. Harry's career has spanned a huge range of sectors, from oil and gas, food and drink, dairy, nutrition, material science, engineering, plastics, composite, and the list is endless. And also the IP law, so patents, early stage technology. I mean, shall I keep going, or shall I stop there? Today, he's going to share insights from his work driving collaborative innovation and large multi-party initiatives, such as the design of industry sector roadmaps. Welcome, Harry. Dr. Ruchi Chowdhury is a reader of architectural engineering at the University of Cambridge. She specializes in simulation methods for predicting energy demands of the built environment. She's leading the research group on digital twins of built environment, funded by UKRI, the program AI Science for Government at the Alan Turing Institute in London. At Cambridge, she leads the multidisciplinary Energy Efficient Cities Initiative. Her research spans simulation-based methodologies for energy management of buildings. In 2019, she became Fellow of the International Building Performance and Simulation Association, IBPSA, which is also a delicious Korean dish. And she's now the elected chair of the IBPSA England. And finally, last but not least, Dr. Dan Kerbel leads the science policy unit within the RSC. That's the unit that brings together evidence on health and sustainability themes, making it accessible to decision makers to highlight the key challenges and potential solutions. So Daniel's team, many of whom are in the room, draws on the insights of a community of the over 50,000 RSC members working in the chemical sciences industry in the UK and internationally. Dan's here. He will talk today about what he's learning from other parts of the materials economy. So welcome, Dan, and please join me in welcoming the whole panel. Okay, same format as the first session. I'm going to get each of our panelists in turn to introduce their ideas and prompt the discussion, and then we will discuss it amongst ourselves. So Ian, starting with you, you've been part of the PLFs task force since 2021. Can you describe for us what the drive for sustainable PLFs will mean for your business as a producer of specialty ingredients? What about the partnerships involved to develop novel formulations?
Okay, yeah. So I guess perhaps just before we start, perhaps put my role in a bit of context. So I'm firmly sat in the global synthesis teams with the role of taking chemistry molecules, scaling them up through the labs, through pilot scale, and then onto production assets. I'll perhaps use a few examples in context of Croda just to show the practicality of what I'm talking about. 95% of probably what we do in Croda is chemistry related, although that probably what the company won't look like in the future as we shift to more towards biotechnology based solutions. So the company is largely driven, obviously, as many of the points that have already been made, by consumers, by changes in legislation. and firmly embedded in most companies at the moment, there is clear sustainability targets. My view is perhaps that the sustainability criteria and targets across the value chain could perhaps be better aligned in the future, because what I see is perhaps everybody, I think, is heading towards a similar sort of path, but there are perhaps there's some misalignment perhaps in some of the overarching strategies. In the context of Croda, we have a clear ambition that there's a whole raft of different criteria within our sustainability strategy. We have an ambition to become 75% bio-based by 2030. That's clearly set out in the published reports, and it's clearly publicized within the company and externally. We expect actually during product development that 95% bio-based is the criteria that we ask our scientists to try to hit, because to try to move the entire portfolio towards 75% bio-based requires a higher proportion of new product developments coming through to meet that criteria. We see obviously in the past performance, safety were the key requirements to allow us to operate, but sustainability is clearly a license to operate in the markets going forward. We have in Croda climate, land and people positive targets, like many of the different sustainability targets I'm sure you have in your companies or organisation. We've already talked a lot about collaboration. It's outlined in the paper that's just recently been published on PLFs, that you can't necessarily do this in isolation. Many of the feedstocks that we've talked about earlier have well-established supply chains. They have efficient supply chains. The commercial viability is already secured. We have assets all over the world that are designed to deal with these types of chemicals. And I'll talk perhaps a bit more later on about the types of R&D we're doing. But there is a need to collaborate right across the value chain, in my opinion, from feedstocks right through to entering into the markets. And we have various strategies around strategic feedstock collaborations. Obviously, decarbonisation, taking the processes that we already currently have and looking at using green energy, decarbonising, introducing new processes that perhaps bolt onto an existing asset to make that production more efficient. But perhaps in the context of the specific question that you asked, is that in the context of molecule discovery and the discovery phase, working with partners is vital in my view to allow us to succeed. We don't have the capability. We have our own internal programs ongoing, and we have done for a number of years, but accessing the brain power throughout the industry is a real critical part. So we've recently been awarded a 5-year program on sustainable PLFs. We're working with Steve Howdell's team at Nottingham University, and Steve's in the audience. So if you get a chance to speak to him over the lunch break, then please do. And Helen Snedden's team at York University looks after the green chemistry department. So we're accessing the expertise in those groups on polymerization, new monomer sources, new ways of polymerizing them, but also other aspects such as AI, the processing element of these, because we've found through our own internal work that when you start to introduce new solutions to make polymers in perhaps a different way, that you enter into a new realm of perhaps processing and difficulties actually making these products. I think that's perhaps does that answer that? I think that answers the main point to that.
Yeah, it does. And it's really good that this follows almost directly on from Richard Miller talking on the last panel. It's very interesting that what did you say? So you're trying to, by 2030, 75%
of our portfolio will be bio-based by 2030.
So address the question that we were talking about in that last session, which was one of the most significant barriers to moving to new biological sources is scale.
Yeah.
So in terms of how much product, what kilogram mass of chemical you can actually produce.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're obviously, I said that we're probably around 90% chemistry derived, the products that we sell at the moment. We are moving into the area of biotechnology and synthetic biology that's already been mentioned. we've been operating in this area for a long time, and actually the difficulties in setting yourself up in a new process, in a new operation, we perhaps underestimated at the beginning. Areas that we're perhaps used to in the chemical area, which are well refined and the processes are well understood. You enter into a new realm of technology and you uncover new things that you didn't know before you set out. Downstream processing, for example, where you've perhaps got an output that is a complicated mixture, which may not be more, as apparent when you're doing more traditional chemical synthesis. But I think the scaling of generally of sustainable molecules and polymers is apparent across the board. It's not just related to biotechnology. We find, for example, with our existing assets that we can fit some processes onto those, but there needs to be modification to processes as we deal with new feedstocks. The availability of feedstocks is obviously an important part in this. So obviously, it was mentioned earlier that I think there was the magic number, magic 7, is that we're used to dealing with these, and we all, in effect, use these feedstocks, and we differentiate our technology further up the value chain. We haven't got that basis of feedstocks that we have in certain areas, but when we start to look at some of the new polymers, we're finding that the supply chains are not as well established. We've made polymers that biodegrade, that perform as well as synthetic, but the commercial viability is not there at the minute, largely because the supply chain is not as well established as we believe it needs to be in the future.
What does that mean? Is that so? You sort of alluded to that in terms of if you can. So biology produces messy substances, and is purification and extraction a significant issue?
Yeah, I think perhaps not in all cases, but in some cases when you're trying to make more of the specialty. So Croda is a company that makes thousands of products rather than specialises in bulk production. When you start to try to make some of the specialty ingredients for skincare or for personal care, the organism will transform and do that chemical reaction. But there's a lot of other stuff in there that you need to refine and get rid of and purify. Residual proteins, for example, that can cause potential sensitization issues as an example going forward. So that the way in which we're cleaning up and purifying these materials is different to what we're used to in the heritage chemistry area.
But also that biological innovation can be lucrative as a new source of innovation, a new source of pathways that you perhaps stumble across that you weren't looking at.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's like it was already mentioned in the previous talk that we spent years refining the petrochemical-based value chain based on asset production, purification, supply chains. We're entering into a new era. Similar, I guess, to the conversion of diesel and petrol cars to electric. It can't be done overnight. There needs to be a transition period. And I think when we start to carry out that transition, that we uncover things that we didn't know at the beginning. So it's not as easy as just turning off the tap in one area and turning the other tap on.
And what about expertise as well? Because we're here at the RSC. It feels like this is a room full of chemists. I'm the only biologist here. Am I? But synthetic biology is a recent innovation in science, and it's sort of I feel like it's coming out of that hype phase and into the sort of plateau of productivity. Where are you recruiting?
We're recruiting heavily, we're recruiting in both because I guess chemistry, there is still a lot of scope within chemistry to develop and refine it and make it sustainable. So as chemistry is a path forward, as is biotechnology. But we've heavily resourced our biotechnology function. We've built biotech assets in the company to start to carry out some of these chemical transformations. I think generally what we find is that in the context, from my perspective, with biotechnology, we tend to talk about it as an area that will deliver the solutions. We perhaps need to talk about some of the particular molecules and candidates that come from it. Biotechnology won't solve the problems. Biotechnology is a mechanism by which you use to carry out chemical transformations to produce ingredients. So we've found that perhaps we've recruited a lot of people that know a lot about biotechnology and synthetic biology, but teaching them the language of the structure function effects is quite important because they need to know then what molecules to target.
Okay. I've done that thing where you can't answer the question that's been set, so you change it to one that you do know the answer to. Genetics, there's the solution there. All right, well, let's move on, unless you've got questions for Ian. Okay, well, so let's move on to Harry. So this is building on what Ian was talking about, collaboration. Your role at the National Measurement Lab is to foster collaboration and support industry to come up with transformative innovations. Give us a feel for the kinds of collaborative projects that you've seen in trying to drive sustainable innovation.
Thank you so much. First of all, I must say I'm a chemical engineer, so sorry about that. And the second is I'm a practitioner of open innovation, a practitioner of collaborations, and that has taken me, in paths where you sort of work with different people in the food industry and the pharmaceuticals, but you learned from all the war stories of when collaborations go wrong, because that's a reality of the day-to-day of collaborations. It's nice to say, we need to partner, but you need to know how to partner to be able to be transformative as we want to be with this roadmap. And there are things that we have learned along the way, and this is part of what I have brought to the National Measurement Laboratory in trying to scale some of the activities and the transformation that we want. And we have been asked by government to move from being just experts and to provide access to expertise as a national laboratory to actually being a catalyst for innovation, which is a completely different ballgame for expert metrologists that are based in Teddington, where they say, well, now you have to engage at a local level with regions across the UK, and you have to actually work with startups. So when government gives you that brief, then everyone runs. But we have been actually discovering there are things that we can do well in terms of collaborations. And one of those things is summarized by acting local and being seen local, because people can see through just the facade of saying, oh yes, we're here, when you're really not. So we have been creating and collaborating with regional actors and universities to create centers of excellence across the UK, dotted across the UK, to be able to actually be there to support small companies, large companies, in their innovation journey when they have a measurement barrier to the new product, or they come to us and we support them. But at the same time, we sort of span the whole TRL. We also do basic metrology science with universities, and we are investigating new ways of measuring things that are complex, and PLFs are going to be one of those complex, chemicals that you're going to be measuring in different matrices with different formulations in different environments, etc. And that, I think, requires, that you use those collaboration tools across the TRL, so you know how to interact with academics, you know how to interact with large companies, and you know how to interact with startups. And some of the examples that I actually jot together last night, first of all, the novel detection systems, because a lot of the things that are going to be needed, not just for manufacturing, not just for recycling, is how do you detect these things? How do you online monitor waste streams and all that? So how do you develop sensors that are rapid enough in diluted conditions that they can inform, what the composition of your streams are and what to do, around the processes that you develop to recover them, etc. There's also method validation, because that's part of what a national measurement laboratory is. We create the standards, we create the new methodologies to actually tell people what you're measuring is exactly what it is that you're supposed to be measuring. So companies can come to us and do method validation. And I think that would be really important when we develop this new ecosystem that is mentioned in the roadmap, about people interested in biomaterials, biopolymers, etc. That what the method that are developed to measure them, either in formulation or in waste streams, or even in solid in solid matrices, they are actually standardized, and then all industry can use it, and therefore, therefore you can set a standard that can be used not just for the UK, but you can export that standard around the world, and that gives you a competitive advantage in that respect. So that's one of the aspects of collaboration.
Can I jump in and just ask Ian? Is it? I don't know whether you two have ever worked together, but is this the type of thing that this sort of measurements and supplying of tools? Is that a thing that helps innovation in your labs?
Yeah, I mean, I think it always has. The characterization, you need to know what you've made to determine structure function effects. I think the area where it's perhaps more apparent to us at the minute is in biodegradability testing. So we understand quite well structure function effect of molecule effect performance, but when we start to look at making molecules biodegrade, we often talk about complete mineralization through to CO2. Does the biodegradability of something to an oligomer or a monomer, is that okay? I think it's an area that perhaps we underestimated how. I guess I set off on this thinking we'll run some biodegradability tests with external test houses and we'll get some consistent answers, and that wasn't the case. And we've put a lot of effort in internally to actually try and establish, so particularly in molecule and degradation, product characterization, that's an area that's of real interest that we've come across.
Sorry to interrupt, Harry, but you were going to give a second example.
I was going to give it is related exactly with what you're saying, because one of the things that I saw in the roadmap is microplastics and nanoplastics. So you might think that it's very easy to characterize these materials, but when they are mixed with soil, or they are part of a water effluent, or they are in a sediment, it's complicated to measure these particles and how they behave. So we can work together to develop those new standards for nanoplastic and microplastics in those in that sort of medium. And the last example is actually how we work with small companies, and we are part of the national UK measurement system. It's called the UK measurement system that involves NPL, ourselves, and other national laboratories. We're a resource that, to be honest, have been underutilized, by industry, by government, because we were not given the mandate to do what we are mandated to do today, which is catalyze innovation, and that's a completely different ballgame. We are working in a program funded by UKRI, and this is an example of something that we can do easily in this space called Analysis for Innovators, and this is working with startups that will have a measurement problem in the product innovation journey, and then they apply for a small grant, 50,000 to 250,000, which for a small company is a lot of money, and then they access our capabilities through this program, and it has been really successful. Some of the examples, of course, range from food to contamination, but that doesn't mean we cannot use some of these grants or establish a similar program dedicated to PLFs. I think the fact that it's available and the fact that we are local, we can actually support those companies to apply, because believe it or not, we made a poll and people were saying, we don't use your services because you're based in Teddington and we're in Scotland, or so people don't go to the labs because it will take them 2 days to take the samples, etc. But if you can establish a network of laboratories across the UK that can do these sort of things for small companies and for large companies that are standardized and they have methods that everyone can apply, then it's much easier for them to access these type of programs. So that's my 3 examples.
No, that's great, and I really appreciate that you're giving practical. This is what the phrase that Roy used at the beginning, dialogue for delivery. That's what we are doing in this day and in this session. But I want you to go even more granular for it.
Okay.
And can you just give us a specific example of the process? Because you've been talking about how a company, a startup, or a university department will come to you, or you will go to them, and there's a framework for that to happen. But what is the actual process that starts with someone in the lab coming up with a new product, chemical?
Let me see if I understand the question. So
I think about if I was in the lab with
Yes.
Tom's flask, 500 ml flask, and I've got something, what happens next?
in the innovation journey, I like to call it innovation journey. There's always the idea, and the idea is cheap. But once you transform this idea into a prototype, then you're onto something. You can start showing that flask around, and you can start making developing tests specific for that material that you have made, and then you start talking to industry, and that's when the links establishing that ecosystem early on of large companies, small companies is needed, because you very quickly can ask the larger companies, okay, I have this is how it behaves, what other things do you need that material to be able to do, so I can tweak it around, I can specifications, regulations, etc. And then you need to start then thinking about manufacturing, which I think is the bit that a lot of the startups come across as a big barrier. How do you scale it up? And that's not an easy question, but that creating that ecosystem, being close and being an easy dialogue, again, a dialogue for delivery, an easy dialogue between large companies and small companies, orchestrated. And I like the word orchestrated because this is what we want to be. We want to orchestrate all this different dialogues and bring in metrology early on in the discussion, so people know exactly what they're measuring, exactly the sort of material corresponds to what they think they are synthesizing, and that they use the methodologies to actually make sure that the standards that they follow are easy to be reproduced anywhere else where they want to in the world that they want to manufacture it, etc.
And at the beginning, when I was introducing you, you have had many hats in your career.
Yes.
Does the IP, does intellectual property figure into this framework?
So it is central to protecting what you are actually discovering if you're going to make it commercial and you want to translate this into market. And if you want to translate it into market, you need to protect it. Startups, they are made aware early on that if they have intellectual property, they need to protect it. But also what I have seen lately, especially in the food industry, is that people want to have, and I don't remember who mentioned the word sandpits. And the sandpits are becoming more and more the thing to do, where large companies get together and put a sandpit for people to play. There's an example that I'm aware of in Denmark. I was advising this group, Novo Nordisk. They put the money to create the sandpit, and in the food industry, they bring in all the value chain together, from consumers to academics to startups to agriculture, production, transformation, and then they put this sandpit for them to create projects. Once the project is cross value chain and important enough, transformative, then they put the money for that project to go ahead. The IP is out of the question because the IP needs to be shared between the people that are put into the project, and therefore these projects are pre-competitive in nature, but it's something that everyone will be needing to use to develop their own IP for specific applications later on. I think something similar can be used for PLFs, where you have pre-competitive projects, cross value chain, creates data that then is used by different actors and different parts of the value chain for their particular applications, and then they protect their particular applications.
Okay, any questions from the rest of the panel? Okay, well, we'll move on then, perfectly on time. This is the most punctual meeting I've ever been to.
Must be something in the water.
Yes. PLFs, maybe. Ruchi, over to you. So you work in both sustainability and AI, but not specifically in polymer chemistry.
No, not at all.
Not at all. And when I was introducing you, we were talking about your work in digital twinning to support more rapid sustainability transition. Can you talk about what digital twinning is and how best to deploy digital twins for the broader picture of sustainability transitions that we're discussing today?
Yes, sure. And maybe to contextualize it, maybe I can give an example of what I've been working on. So I work on energy use in buildings, and back in 2013 or 14, I was interested in plants in buildings, and I work on numerical models. So I became interested in not how humans interact with the indoor environment, but how plants do it. And that has a legacy of me working with Q to help them decarbonize. But basically, I was interested in modeling evapotranspiration and the photosynthesis process to understand how plants exchange heat and moisture with the environment. And I came across this underground farm, which is below, which is basically built in the former air raid shelters in Clapham. And they were growing microgreens that time. They were experimenting with them. And I wanted to help them decarbonize, basically, ensure that they are getting maximum productivity out of minimum energy input. And that led to an interesting journey of what do you need to measure, what do you need to model? Is measuring sufficient? Is modeling sufficient? And why do you need both? And or one or the other? So we started the process of putting in sensors to measure environment, to measure, sort of air velocity, temperature, humidity, things that were relevant to us. And at the same time, we were also developing numerical models that would follow the process of the farm. And in doing so, we realized that actually none of them by themselves are complete, because data is data unless you translate it into information, and that's a messy process. Similarly, models are sort of reflections of reality, but they are not reality. They sort of capture the process in a partial manner. And then came the opportunity of digital twinning. And I know there's a lot of hype and fatigue around digital twinning across both industry and across research. But I found it to be an extremely useful concept to describe what we've been trying to do here, which is that you take data, and data by itself is meaningless. So you need a process by which you need to translate data into meaningful information. And there are several challenges pertaining to that. Similarly, for models also, models are abstractions of reality. So the whole opportunity of digital twinning is you pair the two together. And in addition to that, there's another component, which is expertise that's embedded within human brain. So you put all of these together, and the key thing then becomes is that you take something out that feeds to the need of the end user. And that's the critical point. So if you manage to make that loop, which is putting data, putting models, expert knowledge together, and feeding that back into something that turns out to be useful, then that's a successful digital twin. So when we started with the farm, initially they treated us as nuisance, in the sense that, okay, we were coming in as academics, they allowed us to put in sensors, etc. And then for engagement, what we did was a very simple thing. Every Friday, we would send them a PDF that perhaps next week you need to put in more ventilation, or get more dehumidifiers, or remove your broccoli microgreen to the front of the farm because it's happier with more ventilation, or the environment in that part of the tunnel is better suited. And we did that systematically, and after about maybe 10 weeks, 12 weeks, we were busy and we didn't do that, and we got a phone call. Where is that PDF? And that was basically even before we had digitized the whole process. And then we worked with software engineers, because students and researchers, they are good at getting sense out of the data. So we packaged it into something that was easy and usable for the farmers. And before we knew it, they basically were using it every morning when they started the business, and every evening when they ended the business, to follow their process. So what was the digital twin doing? It was basically giving them a dashboard of the current state of the environment. But in addition to that, it was assimilating the new data every morning, rerunning the models, and telling them what to expect for the day and for the next day. And we did that at the expense. Sometimes we compromised between what would be more interesting for us in research to what would be more useful for the farmers. And it did require adept skills. So I'm an architect and a self-trained engineer. I teach in a civil engineering group. But I work with data as well. You know, all engineers actually work with data. Actually, all scientists work with data. So it required skills of, so we had within the whole collaboration community, we worked with plant scientists in order to understand how plants grow, what they like, what they don't like. We worked with numerical modelers, we worked with data scientists, we worked with software engineers. So it really, the skill set had to be quite wide, and it required a lot of collaboration across different groups and communities. And that took time and patience. It's then there are some very pedestrian elements of building something like this, which have to do with trust, which have to do with reproducibility, that, you know, which have to do with basically curation of data. Because, you know, data can be a lot of junk. You have to deal with very sort of boring things like, data missingness or, sensor health. So a lot of times when people talk of digital twinning, they're talking about the sort of soft side of it. But they forget that data comes out of hardware. And that hardware is actually one of the most fragile infrastructures that we have. So you put your head around and you think that you're getting data out of a sensor, which is the hardware side. And if you don't look after it, in 2 weeks, it's giving you wrong information. And also, it may not be suitable for different circumstances. So if you're working in a laboratory setting, and depending on where it is, then some kind of sensors may not be as suitable as other kind of sensors, then communications across. So the whole cyber physical infrastructure is a very, very important part of digital twin, and maintaining it is a challenge. Maintaining it to give information that is accurate enough. So then, yes, that leads to the point about, how do you measure accuracy? How do you trust information that's coming out of a digital twin? How do you standardize it? How do you share it across communities? So all of these things are important. And often what I found is that there's a lot of time and money spent on digital twinning that ends up in pink elephants in the room. And I think the point is to start small, like start with a very clear focus on usability.
No, that's fascinating, because what you've just described is you created the market need for the data service that you were providing.
Yes.
By going to them and saying, we can do this. So I've got a number of questions, and if there's, do jump in, because how this is relevant to PLFs and the PLF pipelines is what's the point of today is. But that you touched on something which I think is fascinating. The balance between you tweaking the system because it's interesting from an academic experimental point of view, and their need to optimize the process, whatever the process is, sort of doesn't matter.
Yeah.
How do you weigh those two things up?
Yeah, that was a balance, and we had to play it pragmatically according to time, because there are, sort of PhD students involved, postdocs involved. But fortunately, because of Alan Turing Institute, I also had access to professional research software engineers. So essentially, you have to kind of figure out where time needs to be spent. But basically, the the way that we managed around it is that the research software engineers were responsible for the end usability. And so sometimes we overdid, right? We overdo things because we are interested in the technology itself or the science itself, and we want to explore, and we must explore. But what then filtered into the front end of the digital twin was only things that were directly usable. So yes, we did use fancy technologies. We used, like, the way that we are updating our models using particle filters and, data assimilation, and the way that we are exploring different types of models with just the data to forward predict the conditions. But the ones that we translated onto the interface that the farmers saw were things that we could trust, that were usable, not things that necessarily we could publish.
And so what I'm hearing here is very much a sort of Rowan-based discussion, that this is mission-based, and it's all about dialogue between you and the practitioners. Does anybody else want to chip in? Can you see how this sort of strategy might work in terms of your pipelines?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely part of our Discovery Blaze platform. We can see the value in it, and I think there's areas where we create value from this, where the data is quite organized, or we get a regular output from something. I think the point you made about looking after the data, I think in some areas we perhaps don't look after the data. So when you start to go in specific applications or looking at retracing back to molecule design into functional effect in an application, it tends to diverge a bit. So we get pockets of expertise, but we don't tie it together.
Yeah, that's exactly. And, when you start putting together a system like this and you have an end use, like, so in this case, for example, we knew that we had to maximize yield and with minimum energy input. So we were sort of monitoring things from my side, because I'm not a plant scientist. I was focusing on the environment. But then we said, but we should know about plants as much, because, we basically are interested. So the farmers were so engaged by that point that they helped us implement the digitization of the plant growth themselves. So at the end of it, we were also able to monitor how many days the plants were taking to go from germination to full harvest, how much was the yield, was there any waste. So all of that became digitized at the end. And then we were able to find new and interesting correlations between the environment and the yield, or any kind of waste that was happening. And that, we didn't create that out of, okay, here's this data, let's see what we can do with it. I think what worked here was that we had a mission, and then we said, okay, what do we need to observe? What is observable? Or what are the things that are, that are not observable directly, but we need to indirectly observe? So, and what are the ways in which we can do that? So that was a very interesting process to go through, where you go from a quantity of interest, like, decarbonization or net zero, and then you go backwards from there. Okay, what do I need to know in order to get to that?
What about the pitfalls? We talked about this very positively. What are the difficulties in this sort of feedback?
The difficulty is that one needs to have time and patience, literally, in a very pragmatic way. You have to work through many different specialities. So you have to get engagement from different expertise. So, and it requires a degree of fearlessness to do that, because, you're talking to computer scientists, you're talking to plant scientists, you're talking to, farmers, then us with our energy agenda. So the whole collaboration process can be sometimes difficult because of communications and because of different languages that we use. So, for example, I don't understand anything about the PLF industry, but anyways, here I am. So So that's one of the pitfalls, that it doesn't require one expertise. You have to be more outward facing.
And presumably that dialogue, your engagement with that requires a lot of dialogue, because you have to understand the needs.
Exactly. So it's a lot of time.
Yeah.
It's a lot of time spent across different communities. Then I found the hardware part to be a challenge. And maybe I found it to be so because, again, that's not my direct expertise. I found good people who could do that, but how to measure things and maintaining and sustaining the health. And also there's the whole point of, you create this digital twin that has a hardware side, that has a software side. It's this whole cyber-physical infrastructure. That also consumes energy. That also needs to be maintained in a frugal and efficient manner. So,
Harry, do you want to comment on that? Because as a supplier of...
Yes, I mean, you said something that is critical. You said reproducibility.
Yeah.
And reproducibility is key, not just for the sensors and the hardware of, and the robustness of those sensors.
Exactly.
To give you the right data. But also, I think we need to understand that the biological sciences is in itself very difficult to put reproducibility as tight as you can get with chemicals. So biomanufacturing, feedstocks and all that, they change, they vary, and that introduces new elements of uncertainty to any of your process, to the characterization that you're doing, because biological sciences are like that. So that's something to get into account, because it's not just going to be replacing chemical feedstock by biological feedstock and you use the same process and voila. No, it's not going to happen like that. So you need more measurements, as you said.
But as you pointed out, within the framework, it becomes also relevant to think about how you're going to manage and reduce and quantify uncertainties.
Correct.
And that's another important element of it.
Dan?
I just had a follow-up question on the practicalities and on the challenges. At the very beginning of your intervention, you mentioned a bit of fatigue around this concept of digital twins, but you found a way to overcome that. And I was thinking about that. If we are trying to sell this as one of the parts that we need on this journey towards sustainable PLFs, how do we sell it to funders? For example, if there's this fatigue perhaps around some of these buzzwords that we use, but behind some of the buzzwords, there are really tangible, very useful things that are perhaps not fully understood in terms of their utility.
I think the point is to understand that this is the whole technology of digital twin is essentially an umbrella term of data, models, feedback. And the hype results from appropriation from one of the elements towards it. So as long as we understand that it's actually something that's a systems of systems approach, it's basically an inclusive technology, which at the bottom line is helping take advantage of the data science and AI revolution. It's helping what we do in a more labor-intensive way to be able to scale it up.
Mm. I mean, I sort of want you to digitally twin my entire life now, and if you could provide me with a PDF on a Monday morning of what I should do. No, I'm dead. I can provide you with plenty of data.
I could, maybe. But again, the time and the effort, is it worth it?
Well, I think we need to experiment with that and find out. We're running out of time, but Dan, let me end with you. So you're the lead of the Science Policy Unit here at the RSC, and that's a very broad spectrum of chemicals and materials, and which includes plastics and other minerals and cement and steel. So with this broad overview, can you tell us how the PLFs initiative might avoid reinventing the wheel? What can we learn in PLF's world from other sustainable transitions that might be happening?
Yeah, so as I witnessed the kind of past 2 years here of the Sustainable PLFs Task Force coming up with a description of the challenges and the potential solutions, I thought of this as new challenges, perhaps something unique to the sector. But yeah, there are, of course, things that are very, very unique to the sector, being in liquid formulation, for example. But as you said, there are some very important comparisons that we can make between PLFs and other materials. So to me, one learning point from our policy work, particularly on plastics, but also on critical minerals, critical raw materials, is it's really important to get the balance right between talking about them as a group of materials, perhaps with one set of solutions, and that can be really important to kind of galvanize groups and create a new kind of forum and so on, versus treating them as or in all their diversity and complexity. So in plastics, there are big differences between different plastic polymers, plastic applications, in terms of their environmental impacts, but also then in terms of what we can do technologically, economically, legislation-wise to make them more sustainable. So it's not just this one answer for this huge group of plastics. And the situation is similar, I think, in critical minerals. So these are all these materials we need for the green transition, but also the stuff that's in our mobile phones. And we're talking about the lithium and EV batteries, neodymium and wind turbines and so on. We've given them this collective term of critical minerals, but in reality, they cut across various different industry sectors as well, who don't necessarily talk to each other. And from a chemistry perspective, they are hugely diverse in terms of their impacts, how they behave in waste, how we recover them. So we do need to keep that in mind when we look at PLFs, in particular when you consider all the different market segments they occupy in our economy. So you mentioned reinventing the wheel, or rather not doing that. There's a lot happening in various different silos in these huge, what looks from the outside perhaps as monolithic things where there are lots of solutions present, but that happens in silos again. So let's not repeat that. There's a lot of learning there that we can draw on.
And specific synergies from other sustainability transitions, are there any ones that you can draw from?
I mean, I feel that plastics, but perhaps also the kind of less industries that aren't perhaps so much at the forefront. So the foundation industries, steel, cement, glass, and so on. I think there's a lot happening there. Again, they're not talking to each other necessarily. So I think let's learn from them. Let's learn from how they think about. So I just said let's not talk about them as monoliths, but on the other hand, we also need to look at them as a whole system and not just talk about individual substances or individual life cycle stages. So in plastics, for example, there is a lot of focus on the end of life, on plastics waste, how to deal with that. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. We absolutely need that. And many manufacturers and legal instruments use that as a lens to try and address the plastics crisis. But we also need to look at we need to zoom out, look at the whole value chain, the whole system, and also think about things like eco-design and what happens further up in the circle, if you will, sort of the refining stage and so on, not just at the end of life. And let's look at reducing the emissions of unnecessary plastics, for example, and reduce the amount of those as well. So I feel for something as ambitious as this agenda around PLFs, if that for that to bear fruit, we really need to look across the whole value chain, the whole system, and link people up, link up the material scientists with the product designers, the people who deal with the waste, and make that work. And I think that organizations like the RSC have a pivotal role there as well, as a convener, assisting people to come together in neutral spaces and so on. And I think the task force was really just the first step in that. So there's a long road of this convening, bringing people together, engaging in non-competitive spaces that we can contribute to.
And that broad overview, so not just focusing on the end of life of particular plastics or products, but the whole life cycle of a material, which incorporates all of the panelists in this session and the previous session as well.
So I feel that's really crucial. It's not necessarily a trap. It's very attractive to talk about, well, depends on what sector you're in, to talk about waste. But it's something that consumers also have perhaps a picture of waste. Let's reduce that, let's make it less harmful and so on. But if we're talking sustainability, we also need to talk about other types of emissions in that sense across the value chain, and make sure that we are honest about that. And so looking at PLFs and the different market segments, again, there are some low-hanging fruits, perhaps, when we talk about cosmetics, for example, or these types of applications that are consumer-facing, and that will look like a very positive, big step to take, but there are much greater, in terms of market share as well, challenges in other market sectors for PLF. So let's keep that in mind as well. But let's not have these as very separate conversations. I think the silos is the big problem, or a big learning point from other sectors.
Okay, so what do you think is required to coordinate all of those processes?
So I mean, the dialogues like this is really, really crucial to also make them a neutral space. So I think with this task force, we've achieved something really quite unique. I've not seen many examples of that, where businesses can talk in a pre-competitive way about something that they will all face, but then really taking it to this next step and bringing in other players of that huge ecosystem. I think we can draw on a number of other programs. I like to mention a program called Transfire that is a UK government-funded program to shift the foundation industries towards more sustainable ways. And they do that, this is in the UK, they bring together researchers with industry across the country, but also trade bodies and professional bodies and regulatory agencies. So these funding programs we also need that make it possible, and we need that catalytic funding, both from private sources and public sources. Otherwise, we will not be able to build up the knowledge base that we need. We will not be able to make long-term plans and policies for PLFs.
Okay, well, we are now out of time, so I'm going to bring this panel to a close. But remember, we've got lunch, we've got sessions all afternoon, and this whole day is really about that dialogue for delivery. And innovation for sustainable chemistry is a core part of the RSC. So this is a plea to everyone out there and everyone in the room that if you're doing interesting things in these spaces, the RSC will want to hear about it and can help. So do share your stories with them. So all that remains is for me to thank the audience and thank our panelists, Ian Tooley, Harry Baratza, Ruchi Chowdhury, and Daniel Corbell. Thank you very much.